Well, hey guys, it's Matt here, ready to talk to you guys about 3 tips for worship piano. So, let's get right into it. Tip number 1 is to play the chords with your right hand and the bass note with your left hand. So let's imagine, for example, that we have a C major chord. It sounds like that. We've got the notes C, E, and G. Now, in terms of figuring out what to do with your right hand and what to do with your left hand, this is really important. As a high school music teacher, I see a lot of students learning to play a song that has chords, and what they do is, if it's a C major chord, for example, they'll get their right hand and play a C major chord, and in their left hand, they'll also play a C major chord. So it sounds like this. That can sound quite full and rich, but often for the style of music that we're playing in at church, that's not usually what we want. Once you are playing the same chord with both hands, there are a few issues that arise with that. Number 1 is when you're playing chords like that, where you're playing the full chord in both hands, as a G chord, because my left hand is playing so many notes so close together, really low on the piano, it can start to sound quite muddy. The second issue related to that is that the bass guitar is going to be occupying that lower area of the piano. Now, if you're playing a full chord with your left hand down in that lower area of the piano, not only will it be muddy, but it will also start to be muddy with regard to the bass guitar and the overall mix. So it won't just muddy what you're playing on the piano, but it will muddy the overall mix that people are hearing in church, and it will get in the way of that bass guitar a little bit down at that low end. The third issue with playing the chord in both hands is that when you shift between chords, it can sound quite clunky. For example, like this. It sounds quite clunky and messy because you've got 6 notes essentially all moving, and in fact every note is doubled, and so you have that sound of notes shifting, but you're having that happen across 6 different notes. So it's really important to not be playing the chords in both hands, okay? This is why I'm saying play right hand chords and left hand the bass note. And that way, and what I often do is play an octave in the left hand, but certainly in quieter moments in songs, in a verse or something, I might play just a single note in the left hand, and then I'll add the octave a bit later on. But that avoids it. If you're not just playing the bass note, it avoids it sounding too clunky, too muddy. When I say bass note, if you're not sure what that means, for a C chord, that just means you'll play a C note in the bass, or a G chord, you'll play a G note in the bass in the left hand, for example. If you ever see one of those chords with a slash, like C/E, that means you can play the note after the slash in the left hand. So you still play a C chord, but C/E means you'll play an E note in the bass in the left hand. Now, another way that people sometimes arrange the right hand and left hand is that they play the melody in the right hand. There's a couple of issues with this. One is you've still got the issue of having that left hand playing a chord, so a bunch of notes close together, down in that lower register of the piano. It's going to interfere with where the bass guitar is playing. It's going to sound muddy anyway on the piano itself because you've got lots of notes in that low end. So it sounds muddy. Just like the other example I gave of playing the chords in both hands, we don't want that kind of muddiness. We want clarity, particularly when you're adding lots of instruments together to make a nice clean sounding mix to send to the front of house. So that's one issue with that. If you're playing the melody in the right hand, sometimes it's not a bad thing to double the melody. There can be crucial moments in a song, or moments where it just works to kind of double the melody in the right hand. When I say doubling, I mean doubling with the vocalist. But often that can get a little bit tiresome if you're doing that for the whole song. And unless you and the vocalist are precisely together and in time and everything, it can start to sound either messy, or even if you are in time together, if you do it the whole song, it can start to sound a little bit messy, having these 2 parts, which are, usually a vocal part has fairly short note values in terms of the length of the notes, and it moves around a lot. So you've got 2 parts doing that, and then adding the other instruments in this style of music, that can start to sound a little bit too busy, and we don't always want that. There's times where that works, but we don't always want that. So there's some issues with these other ways of arranging the right and left hands, which is why I'm saying to you right hand, chords, left hand, bass note. It will sound nice and clean, won't sound messy, won't sound too busy, and there's a lot you can do with that. Okay, tip number 2 for playing worship piano. Our second tip here is to use chord inversions. Now, just as I was mentioning before in tip number 1 about we don't want things sounding too messy or too busy or even clunky, these kinds of words, using chord inversions is a really great way to avoid things sounding too clunky. And the reason for this is, what often happens when someone learns piano for the first time and they're playing chords is, let's say we've got a C chord and a G chord. So we have C, and then we have G, and then we have to jump all the way up here. So we're here, and then we jump all the way up here, and look, and it sounds nice, it's a C chord, it's a G chord, but once you start playing chord progressions like that, where you're jumping all over the place, it can sound quite clunky. For example, this. Sounds quite clunky, right? The way that we can avoid that is to use chord inversions. And the principle behind this is that we want, whatever chord we're going to next, we want to move as little as possible to that chord from the chord that we're currently on. So we want to change as few notes as possible. So the first step is to find the common note in the chord. So say we're going from a C chord, and we've arranged the notes, so we're playing C at the bottom, C, E, G. And let's say we want to go to a G chord, rather than shift everything up so that we're playing G, B, D with G at the bottom, because now our thumb has moved all the way up from C to G. And the E has moved all the way up from E to B, and the G that was in the C chord has moved all the way up to D. So you have this. You've got 3 notes jumping, and that sounds quite clunky. What you can do is have C, E, G. That's how you're what we call voicing or arranging the notes in the chord. For the C chord, what you can do, you notice that between a C chord and a G chord, there is a note that is common. This is important. Lots of chords have common notes between them. So C, E, G, we actually can keep our pinky, I've got our pinky here on G, keep our finger there on G, and then all we have to do is shift the C and the E. So C goes to the next nearest note, which is going to be B, in a G chord. There's a B in the G chord. And then the E goes to its nearest note, which is a D. So rather than going C and then G, we do this. There's a C, we get that. So rather than having a chord progression that sounds like this, which is often played, you get this. Which sounds a lot smoother because you're not having 3 notes suddenly all shift position. You've got some notes that have common notes between them. So a good way to do this if you're just starting out, trying to figure out chord inversions, is to actually sit down and write out the notes in the chords that you're playing, and then look at what the nearest, just think in terms of the alphabet, what's the nearest letter in the alphabet to the different notes. So write out C, E, G, and then you know that the next chord is G, B, D for a G chord, and then you've got to figure out, okay, I've got a C, now what note out of G, B, D is going to be closest to the C? Well, B is closest to C. I guess in the alphabet B and D are similar, but on the piano B is closer to C. So put B there, E will then go to D, you've got 2 notes left. We know that G is a common note anyway, that just would leave the E, which then needs to go to the D. And that's a good way to, if you just write that out, you start to think in that way, and as you become more familiar with chords and know what notes are in each chord, you'll be familiar with how to figure out what is the arrangement of notes in the chord that will work for where I'm going with the next chord. So you can always rearrange notes in a chord. You don't always have to have the bass note or the root note of the chord at the bottom. So if it's a C chord, the C doesn't always have to be played by your thumb. Or if it's a E minor chord, the E doesn't always have to be played by your thumb. Okay, the bass note you can leave up to your left hand, and then you can rearrange the notes in whatever order in the right hand that is most comfortable based on the particular chords that you're playing to make it nice and smooth. Okay, so tip number 1, we've seen that the right hand plays chords, the left hand plays the bass note. Tip number 2, we've seen that we should use chord inversions, which is simply rearranging the notes in the chord, and so we don't make it clunky. And the third tip is to explore this wonderful instrument, the piano. Because the piano, out of many instruments, is one of the biggest ranges of notes. We can go to this note, all the way up to here. Now, probably if we're playing a worship song at church, we're probably not going to be bashing away down there. Although you might want to go there. But if you're feeling a bit adventurous. But generally speaking, we probably want to stay in more towards the middle area of the piano, but we don't always have to stay right in the middle. We can move up towards the upper mid register of the piano, we can call it, or the lower mid register of the piano. And this is depending on what the song is. This is depending on what the rest of the band is doing, what other instruments you have. We want to be thinking about what are the other instruments. Am I going to have, if the guitar is playing a bit more in its upper mid-range, you could stick in the middle, right in the middle of the piano, or stick even a bit lower than that to create a bit of space in the mix. So you can always be thinking in terms of the other instruments and how the overall sound of the front of house mix might sound to the congregation at church. But you can also think in terms of using different registers of the piano, different areas of the piano, the highs, mids and lows, how you're going to use that to develop the song that you're playing, how to build it. Because if there is a lighter moment in the song where the band has stripped back what they're playing, you might want to play up there, okay? And just leave some space in the sound. And then as it builds up, you might want to actually slowly creep down. So that's your chord progression. I was doing A minor, F, C, and G. You might want to creep down as the song builds, and as other instruments come in, you might want to creep down to the middle register of the piano. Okay, so it's not sounding quite as fragile, because that could be the sound that we want for a verse or a stripped back start of a bridge. Let's say this is a bridge, right? Do you see how I moved? As the music built up, I got louder for starters, because that's how I would build with the song, right? But I'm moving down, so by the end of it, I'm kind of there. I'm using left hand, I'm using octaves. So going back to what I said in the first tip, using the octave. I'm going down in the lower register of the piano to create a bit of extra punch. Whereas at the start, I was just using single notes for the bass note in the left hand. And also, as I was moving down, I was changing the inversions I was using. I was changing how I was arranging the notes in the chord, so that would sort of facilitate me getting lower and lower down the piano as the song builds up. So that could be one way you could use registers in the piano, this idea of, the different sections of the piano, the highs, the mids, the lows, and how you're going to use that. Don't, use the extremities of the piano's range sparingly, but you can really use it to build in a song. Another example of this is in a big moment, where you can really complement for example, the bass is hitting just a really low note, to create a bit of punch, potentially on a sustained chord in a kind of big moment. You might want to join in with playing that low note, okay? Once again, just you might want to play an octave. We're not playing a whole chord down in the lower register of the piano. We're just playing an octave. So for example, if you look at the recording that Kaylee and I did on, a recording we did of Praise the King, you'll notice that at the start, once again, it's a similar thing of like moving down the piano. I move down the piano, right, as the song builds towards the verse. And on that note, because it's a big note, right, I pick down here. I pretty sure they do that in Corey Voss in his original recording. You can hear on YouTube. I think there's a similar thing. It just creates this big sound, okay, like it's preparing us for something big in the song, and it's sort of anticipating, obviously, that moment where the song speaks of Christ's resurrection. So, there are some tips for you. 3 tips for worship piano. Hopefully that's helpful for you in developing your piano playing. So just to run through them again. First tip, right hand chords, left hand bass line. Second tip, use chord inversions where you're rearranging the notes in the chord so it now sounds nice and smooth. And the third tip is to utilize the different registers of the piano. That will help you build and develop a song, and you can really, change registers in different sections of a song to really delineate the structure of the song and show how the song really develops lyrically to help people just really focus on the greatness of what God has done for them in Christ. So, they're my tips. Hopefully it's helpful for you. Happy practicing.